It's such an honor to speak about um, the the issues facing the AAPI community in here this month of May for Beazley Race, and I just want to share a few words of appreciation. Um, Beazley Race, which is aimed at including, understanding, and celebrating people of color. Esther Lim, first of all, for connecting me to Mary Trin, who then connected me to John Perry, Karina Varma, Shamiso Chimbo, and other Beazley Race friends. And I want to thank everyone here who has spent time in their day to come and listen to this presentation and to ask questions. Since Beazley is a global entity, I want to make sure that we've got more than just the American terms covered here. There's British terms that are used in terms of referring to Asian persons. And while I won't be using them in this way, I'm told that a British Asian person is someone of Indian, Pakistani, or Bangladeshi origin who has grown up in Britain. So in this case, oftentimes Asian is really referring to South Asian when it comes to Britain. And British East Asian is China, Southeast Asia, more so than, say, Indian. I'll use the shorthand term Asian to include East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian in this US-centric presentation. But before I move it to its US-centric nature, I just want to acknowledge the fact that, if anybody is interested in understanding some more from if I watch these movies, Bandit Like Beckham and Blinded by the Light, and I could appreciate that the discrimination faced by South Asians, what I refer to as South Asians, but what I guess in the UK is often referred to as simply Asian communities in the UK. Please, these are really great movies in and of themselves, inspiring movies, but they have elements where you can appreciate certainly the challenges faced. And words like Paki, which are derogatory for Pakistanis and so on, that are used in the UK are really deplorable. And the UK itself really has come at some level to understand that it is really time to talk about anti-Asian racism there. In this piece by Tom Matsuda, who's a British-Japanese writer based in London for Al Jazeera from last year, he writes that while the US administration appears to be finally acknowledging the urgent need to address anti-Asian hate and discrimination in the UK, where the problem is equally grave, the authorities are still turning a blind eye to the plight of Asian communities. UK police data suggests a rise of 300% in hate crimes towards Chinese, East Asian, and Southeast Asians in the first quarter of 2020, compared with the same period in 2018 and 2019. And there have been so many incidents in the UK. I'll just mention a few. In March of 2021, a Chinese university lecturer, Peng Wang, was attacked by a gang of men in the city of Southampton. In November 2020, an Edinburgh mom, Wei Saik, was physically assaulted and racially abused by a group of teenagers while walking home with her two small children. She said they shouted COVID as they smacked her on the head, leaving her terrified. And it's not just, of course, Asians that are walking in the streets and being attacked. It's also healthcare workers like Filipino nurse Aldarico Jr. Valsco, who was, who had effing Chinese screamed at him by a patient of his, which is really incredible. I mean, these are healthcare workers trying to help during a pandemic, and they're being attacked in this way. And the history, of course, of discrimination against Asians and East Asians in the UK is long, dating back all the way to really 1901, when the first Chinese laundry in London opened. It was immediately stoned by a hostile crowd. And in 1908, in opposition to cheap Chinese labor, crowds of angry British seamen prevented their Chinese colleagues from signing on as ship's crew. So there's so much there to unpack. But again, the focus of my presentation, and certainly my expertise, is more on the anti-Asian hate and the, in this case, Asian American dilemma. So I'll talk about some of the historical context of anti-Asian hate here in the US, the political context of anti-Asian hate, understanding the Asian American dilemma in its position where Asian Americans are often seen as white adjacent and sometimes not always thought of as people of color, although we are people of color, and violence and anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes, and then conclude. So just to set the historical narrative here, it all really starts where in the US, in a case called the People versus Hall, Chinese immigrants began coming to the United States in significant numbers in the 1850s, largely to California and other Western states to work in mining and railroad construction. There was a high demand for these dangerous low-wage jobs, and Chinese immigrants were willing to fill them almost immediately. The racist trope of Asians coming to steal white jobs was born. And in 1854, the California Supreme Court reinforced racism against Asian immigrants in People versus Hall, a ruling that the people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court because it was deemed as they weren't equal or whatnot. So virtually guaranteeing that whites could escape punishment for anti-Asian violence. So in this case, it was really quite incredible that one could take that. Then you have here this iconic photograph that records the celebration marking the completion of the first transcontinental railroad lines at Promontory Summit in Utah on May 10th, 1869. When you look at this picture, you see Leland Stanford, for whom, whose son bears the name of the Stanford University, co-founder of the Central Pacific Railroad, connecting eastern and western sections of the railroad with a golden spike. You'll be hard-pressed to find a Chinese railroad worker here. I think if you look carefully, you might find one somehow snuck in there, but that is really the narrative of so much that goes on in the United States, where the work is done by the Chinese, and the credit here at that seminal moment is literally one of non-Chinese in the picture. Here are some photographs taken during the railroad's construction that features Chinese laborers, and more photos can be found, ironically, at Stanford University's Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project website. Then you have the Chinese Exclusion Act that the United States federal law that was signed by President Chester Arthur on May 6, 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers, building on the earlier Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first and remains the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. These are some images from that time: the Chinese wall around the United States of America. Notice: communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen. Of course, you then have World War II and internment camps where Japanese are told to essentially go and live in these, Japanese Americans are told to live in these internment camps. And so that's May 3rd, 1942. The internment of Japanese Americans in the US during World War II was the forced relocation and incarceration in concentration camps in the western interior of the country of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of whom lived on the Pacific coast. About 2/3 of the internees were US citizens. These actions were ordered by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt shortly after Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. So from killing and mass shootings in 1871, we'll talk about that in 1982, 1989, and of course, closer to the present, 2020s here. There was a Chinese massacre in 1871 on October 24th, following the murder of a white man caught in the crossfire between rival Chinese groups. More than 500 white and Hispanic rioters surrounded and attacked Los Angeles' small Chinese community centered in a red light district known as Negro Alley. At least 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched, including a prominent local doctor. They were hanged across several downtown sites, anywhere the rioters could find a beam to string a noose. 8 of the rioters were eventually convicted of manslaughter, but their convictions were overturned. No one else was ever punished. Then you jump to a very famous killing, the killing of Vincent Chin, who died on June 23rd, 1982. He was a Chinese-American draftsman who was beaten to death in a racially motivated attack by two white men, Chrysler plant supervisor Ronald Evans and his stepson, laid-off auto worker Michael Nitz. Evans and Nitz assailed Chin following a brawl that took place at a strip club in Highland Park, Michigan, where Chin had been celebrating his bachelor party with friends and in advance of his upcoming wedding. They assumed that Chin was of Japanese descent. This is during the decline of U.S. autos, and are alleged to have used racial slurs as they attacked him. They blamed the success of Japan's auto industry, despite the fact that Chin was Chinese, right? Then in 1989, and this is really emotionally reminiscent of what just happened yesterday, really, but a deranged white man aiming his bullets at Asians. And really, this is a lesson that we can't forget. I mean, this was Cleveland School in Stockton. This Cleveland Elementary School on January 17, 1989, was attacked after a heavily armed gunman invaded the schoolyard and killed 5 children and injured 30 others before killing himself. The aim, it turns out, even though at the time it wasn't talked about this in this manner, was actually to get rid of Asian students that this gunman felt had been invading his country. So the Cleveland School had a large Cambodian and Vietnamese student body, and that one of the last things that the perpetrator, Purdy, told a bystander, according to the Van de Kamp report, was that, quote, "the damn Hindus and boat people own everything." And that's incredible, given that obviously, at the time it wasn't seen as racially motivated, but we can see that it was. And of course, fast forward to 2021, the Atlanta killings, 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women, and 1 other person was wounded. This is in Atlanta, Georgia. To make things worse, the officer who did the press conference after the mass shooting said that the shooter was having, quote, a bad day. He himself, the officer, had promoted racist COVID-19 shirts on Facebook, where he says, "Love my shirt," Well, of course, the reaction from the community was, "We have bad days too, but we don't. You don't see us killing white people." And to set up the political context of of anti-Asian hate, I don't think we need too much to convince you that it doesn't happen by accident. I mean, when the president at the time of the United States crosses out the word corona to replace with the word Chinese, this is simply a message for his base that this is coming from a certain country, this is coming from a certain people. And of course, using words like Kung Flu seems innocuous enough, but it's absolutely unhelpful and downright promotes discrimination. And what's even more incredible is when asked, do you think it's appropriate or inappropriate to refer to COVID-19 by names such as China virus and Kung Flu? There's 34% of people here saying that it's appropriate. I mean, thankfully, it's a majority that think it's inappropriate, but there's still 34% that do not seem to see anything wrong with that kind of language. Anyhow, Asian, of course, is not a virus. Understanding now the Asian American dilemma, and this is where what I mentioned earlier, this idea of certainly breaking certain stereotypes. So the perpetual foreigner stereotype. Being Asian American means living in a country that treats you as a perpetual foreigner. Here, this image of you're not really Asian, or no, where are you really from, right? And of course, the idea that Asians somehow possess this model minority idea, which is a myth, really. It's a racial wedge. On the whole, Asian Americans are wedged in the uncomfortable position as white adjacent on the one hand and people of color on the other. And they're complex of a set of stereotypes that has rendered them invisible in discussions of race and prejudice in America. This is from a report that Ascend, a Pan-Asian leadership organization of business professionals and board members, to which I'm a lifetime member, released. There's a lot of this is based on this idea that somehow Asians are a different type of minority, this model minority. And for example, the truth is that 2.1 million undocumented youth qualify for the DREAM Act. 10% of them are of Asian origin. That between 2005 and 2009, AAPI suffered from a 54% drop in median household wealth, or that from 2007 to 2010, AAPIs had the highest share of long-term unemployment, and that there are large groups, including Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, who haven't finished high school, 35 to 40% in that community. So it's not at all that, Asians, the model minority, are somehow all doctors and lawyers, and it's unhelpful when presidential candidates refer to I know a great doctor, or I have this Asian doctor friend. That this is all treading on the stereotypes. For example, this cover of Time magazine, those Asian American whiz kids, who certainly before were model minority, but after COVID-19 become the Chinese virus, right? So now I'll move on to violence and anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes, of which Esther will certainly talk more about, but I'll just mention that just in the last few months, we know that it's been heartbreaking. The killing of one and the wounding of 5 at the Irvine Taiwanese Presbyterian Church in Laguna Woods, California. This was not an anti-Asian hate crime, but this was a motivated hate crime against African Americans, but the racially motivated massacre in Buffalo, New York, of 10 people and the wounding of 3 others at a Black neighborhood supermarket. The murder of Zinat Hussain, a 24-year-old Bangladeshi student pushed in front of oncoming New York City subway, like the horrific murder of Michelle Gao in January of this year. The shooting of 3 at a Korean American hair salon in Dallas, Texas, an incident potentially connected to 2 earlier acts at Asian-run businesses, and the brutal attack against 2 Sikh men visiting New York from India. The reports of hate crimes against Asians between 2020 and 21 has increased by 300+%. In fact, there were nearly 11,000 anti-Asian hate incidents reported between March of 2020 to December of 2021. So really, these are brutal and senseless acts of violence, whether they're racially or politically motivated, whether they're interracial or inter-Asian. There's really no place in our society for them. And I will say, I'll be the first really to say that, it isn't just hate from outside the Asian community or from other groups against Asians. Even within the Asian community, there's a lot of discrimination. There's a lot of racism that also needs to be addressed. I think some of that is absolutely the case, and we need, as a community, also to reflect and look at ourselves in the mirror. So just to conclude here, the descendants of the Chinese laborers who worked on the railroads were able to reclaim some of that history by remaking the picture at Promontory in Utah. This is a group of Asian Americans, including descendants of Chinese railroad workers, who recreated an iconic photo on the 145th anniversary of the first transcontinental railroad at Promontory Summit, Utah. I think it's this kind of action that tries to say, wait a minute, the history of it was wrong. We need to talk about these things. And certainly, I haven't been immune to it myself. I mean, Mary said that I'm the chair of the API advisory board, but before I was the chair, and even as chair, things had happened where in December of 2018, 4 years ago, really, this was written on my minivan after we parked to attend a parade. And I guess some young people were not understanding what it means or how to behave. And it reminded me actually of an October 2019 show on a podcast I listened to called Risk, in which the storyteller, Chris Redd, gave some advice from his father. He said, "Listen, son, do you know how hard it is to be racist? To be racist, you have to be mad all the time, constantly just mad and ignorant. That takes a lot of work. How do you beat a racist? You keep succeeding. While I have to wipe off that Sharpie on the car today, he was describing an incident in which the N-word had been written on their car. He can't ever wipe off my success, and he's going to stay mad. And still, of course, it hurts, right? I mean, it hurts because there are microaggressions every day and hate. My oldest son, Stephen, who's 13, last year was told by a little white boy at a country club pool. We don't belong to a country club, by the way, but we were visiting somebody there. The little boy said, "You have weird skin color," right? I mean, he came to me, Stephen, my oldest, came to me and said, "This is very strange. Why would I have to hear that?" And then just earlier this month, a white classmate with whom he was partnered named a math problem Xing Chong Bing Wang and kept repeating it throughout the class even after being told to stop. You know, Stephen is the only Asian student in that math class. It just seems incredibly insensitive and obviously ignorant for somebody to do that. And these are young people. These are the future, right? That his classmate is going to be the future, whatever, lawyer, doctor, whatnot. And it needs to start sooner. And even as I do what I can as chair of the API advisory board for the LA District Attorney's Office, the work is still not done. There's so much work still to be done. And my inspirations and hopes are really to see my uncle, who is 84, probably 85 now, take his daily walks unafraid, for my mother-in-law to eat in peace without anybody saying anything to her that would be untoward, for my sons, Nathan and Stephen, to be safe wherever they are, and for my daughters, Caitlin and Jasmine, to grow up feeling welcomed and belonging. And for my wife, Chumnan, and I to grow old together without fear. I mean, this is what we all want, right? And as a community, as an AAPI community, we have to also do what we can to help others in terms of an ally continuum. We can't just be apathetic, being neutral. I think it's a favorite quote of Kennedy's, but he paraphrases Dante in saying, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a moral crisis, stick to, steadfast neutrality. You have to have an understanding of the issues. That's the next step. Awareness. Know the basic concepts. Not necessarily be active on behalf of yourself or others, but then switch over to being active, being well-informed, sharing and seeking diversity when asked, when prompted. And then finally, to advocate, to be committed to routinely and proactively championing inclusion. That's the hope. Allyship is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups. So that's what the hope of today's session is going to be, with Esther coming up next, empowering action against hate. And really, I think Esther is going to talk about her incredible work. And I want to thank you, of course, for continuing to succeed and for standing up, because there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. Our allyship is needed. You should understand what hate crimes and hate incidents are. And I'm looking forward to listening to Esther sharing that with you. So I'll end it here. Here's my page online if you ever need to reach out. I'm happy to answer queries at the end of this talk or via email later. So I'm here for you. Thank you very much for this 30 minutes with you today. Back to you.